Hello, this is Agent Swarm for a second video on the Incipit to ANTI-OEDIPUS. First, I'd like to read a little extract from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland that came up last time. It's near the beginning of chapter 3, A Caucus Race and a Long Tail. The animals, including Alice, who has shrunk now, have been swimming in a flood of tears that Alice cried when she was a lot bigger. And now they're trying to dry out. And the mouse is trying to dry them by reciting the driest thing that she knows. That is to say, English history, starting with William the Conqueror. At a certain point, the mouse says, Edward and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable. Found what? Said the duck. Found it, the mouse replied rather crossly. Of course you know what it means. I know what it means well enough when I find a thing, said the duck. It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find? The mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. So here we're getting the contrast between a monological approach, as exemplified by the mouse, and an attempt at dialogue, or is it another parallel monologue by the duck. And the question is over it, which is the first word of Anti-OEDIPUS. It functions everywhere, sometimes without stopping, sometimes discontinuously. So what we see in this paragraph is a sort of dialogue across purposes with psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts. So the proposition is, what do psychoanalysts think of when they hear the word it? Like the duck who thinks of a frog or a worm, the psychoanalyst will think of the id and of, with a bit of luck, partial objects, the breast, the mouth, and so on, or maybe even petit objet A, if it's a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And what do Deleuze and Guattari think of when they say it? Well, they think of something linguistic, because Deleuze, in Logic of Sense, has a whole theory of it as even if it's not the same word in French, he uses il there and not ça, different words for it. But still, he has a whole theory of it, and it is a marker of sense, which is in fact the deterritorialized version of avatar of signification. So when they think of it, they think linguistics. They also think of psychoanalysts. So there's a sort of meta level. Psychoanalysts think of partial objects. They think of psychoanalysts and think also of what psychoanalysts will think of when the word it or id is on the table. So the problem with this approach is that the dialogue is not on the same level. It's for Deleuze and Guattari on the level of concepts, which is in one way or another, whether they are willing to admit it or not, it's a meta level. And the psychoanalysts are working on the object level, the level of reference. So it's a cross purposes there. Secondly, the problem that will come up rather quickly, and this will be discussed in later interviews by Deleuze, is that psychoanalysis is a predefined territory, and it's a terrain that's occupied by the psychoanalyst, or a territory occupied or possessed by the psychoanalyst. So good luck if you want to have a philosophical dialogue, a conceptual dialogue, one about the preconditions and the meaning over and beyond the signification of the terms and practices. If you want a dialogue like that with a psychoanalyst or anyone else who's situating themselves on a predefined terrain, you're going to have problems. So I said that when they think of it, at least at the beginning, they're thinking of psychoanalysts and their partial objects. But later, they abandon this approach. They give it up. It was a good thing to do to accelerate their research, but it was ultimately a dead end. So in the book version of Rhizome, when it was published as a separate book, I've got my version here, but I don't. The cover has fallen off because it's so old. So this is the book version of Rhizome when it was published separately in 1976, and 1976. Yes, 1976. And there are passages in it that they eliminated from the final version in 1,000 Plateaus because they were referring back to the dialogue, to the rather one-sided dialogue, but even a one-sided dialogue is a good thing from the point of view of Deleuze and Guattari. They're referring back to their failed or one-sided dialogue with the psychoanalysts of that time, the French psychoanalysts of the early 70s. They were not going to be interested in what is a dialogical attempt to deterritorialize their territorial concepts. So they begin thinking of psychoanalysts and their partial objects. In Rhizome, they start off a little like Anti-OEDIPUS, which begins with it and deterritorializes the term. That's what they're doing from the very beginning. They don't talk about deterritorialization straight away. They bring up the term later, but our question should be not just what they say. Everyone knows when they read the paragraphs, they understand what it says, but what is happening when they say it. So one of the first things that we noted, that instead of saying the id, we should say it. And that's a pluralization, but it's not just any pluralization, it's a pluralization of a special sort that is the process of deterritorialization. And I hope to be able to give some more sense to the concept of deterritorialization. And the chapter, as I said in the last video, ends with the conjunctive synthesis, where the person, the human agent, is led to say I, but multiplied, pluralized, deterritorialized I is all the names of history. In fact, I, for the philosopher, is all the names, that is to say, all the conceptual characters or conceptual personae that I am aware of or creating with in this book or in my thought. So it goes from the first chapter of Anti-OEDIPUS goes from deterritorializing deterritorializing it to finishing with deterritorializing I. Rhizome takes it up from that point. It begins with a deterritorialization that is a pluralization. We wrote Anti-OEDIPUS together. Since each of us was several, that made for already, or that constituted already lots of people. So they say that they were speaking in their own name, which is already a composite name, Deleuze and Guattari, and even though they signed the book, it was already a multiplicity. So they explain that a little. There's a certain sort of external multiplicity, because when you produce a book, you publish a book, and even before, when you're writing a book, there are all sorts of people in your milieu that are functioning in the extended writing machine, and another set in the publishing machine. And there are also internally to the process, there are lots of people or conceptual personae that are intervening in that writing process. So a basic thesis is there are always more people involved than you think. Whether you're alone or you're lecturing or you're publishing or whatever you're doing, there are always more people involved than you think. So that already constituted lots of people. That's the first paragraph. The second paragraph is this is the omitted paragraph, or one of the omitted paragraphs. We no longer speak much about psychoanalysis. Nonetheless, we speak about it still, and too much. Nothing is happening there anymore. So that's it. In Anti-OEDIPUS, they thought a lot about psychoanalysis, but ultimately, according to them, and that's confirmed by Anti-OEDIPUS, there are a few chapters that are in engagement with psychoanalysis, but it's not preponderant. Another tip for understanding this evolution is they ask in the first paragraph of Rhizome, why did we keep our names? They say by habit, uniquely by habit. So maybe we should analyze Deleuze's analysis of habit. That they continue to make us unrecognizable. So we've got another one of these words with a negative prefix, which are markers of deterritorialization. To make us unrecognizable means to deterritorialize us. It's not just about masking and hiding and ha ha ha, we have a secret inspiration. We'll just use our names. But those who are on the in will know what's going on. We're deterritorializing already from the start, even in the very fact of signing like conventional authors with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They continue, and all this is both ontological reflection and linguistic reflection, as we saw the beginning of Anti-OEDIPUS is. They say, and as well, because it's pleasant to talk like everyone else and to say the sun rises when everyone knows that it's a manner of speech. Not to arrive at the point where one no longer says I. They're already practicing it because they say one, on, and to designate themselves and others like them, and I, one possible vocable that one might use. Not to arrive at the point where one no longer says I, but at the point where that no longer has any importance to say or to not say I. That means the ontology and the conceptual grammar have been so transformed that you can use, no need to invent a new vocabulary, or an artificial or stilted or whatever, or technical vocabulary. You can use the, in quotation, in scare quotes, the old vocabulary, and it means something else. So in fact, when they're talking about psychoanalysis, the unconscious, and partial objects in Anti-OEDIPUS, it's already a conventional manner of talking, because they're taking up or taking on an already constituted territory. And so the meaning is sliding because underneath there is conceptual innovation at work. And we can see that because it starts, it starts with acts that we can sort of relate to psychoanalytically. Seems to go through the phases of sexual evolution, but straight away, before actually talking about the partial objects, it says machines, and not at all metaphorically. Machines are machines, their couplings and their connections. And an organ machine is plugged into a source machine. We're already in a new vocabulary. But the problem is, it's a new vocabulary. So in fact, they've deterritorialized from, away from, or with the, in dialogue with the psychoanalytic vocabulary to try and open it up and change its functioning. But they still haven't gone far enough. Machine, as I remarked, is going to become far less important in a later work. It's still important, it's a useful concept, but it's still not fully deterritorialized. Agencement, assemblage, is even more deterritorialized. They talk about The breast is a machine which produces milk, and the book is a machine coupled with that. So they're talking about breasts and mouths and milk and so on. They're common sense notions and reference. They're also psychoanalytic ones when reviewed in terms of partial objects, but they're also at a more deterritorialized ontological level. They're also parts of machines. They're machine parts. They don't just happen to be included in machines. That's what their ontology is at this point. And even machines, as I said, is a sort of halfway measure for assemblages and multiplicities, which are already at work there, but more backgrounded. So words are being used, but we're told not in their ordinary sense, and they feel obliged to say, but not at all metaphorically. And at the end, they say something is of the paragraph, something else, something is being produced, machine effects and not metaphors. So one way of looking at this is to say that they're warning against the same sort of approach that has already invalidating approach that has already been used against psychoanalysis and that has been deployed against Anti-OEDIPUS, saying it's all poetry, so not to be taken seriously, given that the people who talk like that have a non-serious idea of poetry. So it can be more positive in its valuation. The idea is psychoanalysis is not a science, despite claims of various parts by various psychoanalysts that it is a science. Psychoanalysis is not a science, so it's a sort of poetry, and that can mean it's just playing around more or less elegantly with words, or it can mean psychoanalysis is poetry, and so really comes to grips with the depths of human being, for example. So this idea that non-referential, because non-scientific, although that equation doesn't always work, but non-referential, non-scientific discourse is metaphorical or poetical, is a binary demarcation that Deleuze and Guattari want to avoid. So without going into the whole book and other books, I'm going to take a leaf out of Deleuze and Guattari's saying that we begin in the middle. So I said the first paragraph is the middle of some sort of dialogue, but I can take it a little more literally. I've got the French version of the book. If I look at the page numbers, there's the appendix, the balance sheet for desiring machines, which is a wrong title because it's a balance sheet program. So balance concerns the past, program concerns the future. So they are already in the appendix condensing and deterritorializing so that they can send their noetic arrow even further on. Anyhow, if I look at the page numbers, there's the appendix, and there's the index, and before the little list of other publications by Minuit, we have page 494. So I hope I did this right. I divided it by 2, and I got 247. That looks right, and that's the middle. I mean, this is not exactly like opening the I Ching in the middle and finding some amazingly appropriate sentence, but this time it worked. So on page 247, to situate it in terms of any English translation, it's almost near the end. It's in chapter 3, almost near the end, but not quite. So 3/4 of the way through of the 7th section, which is called Barbarian or Imperial Representation in the subtitles. So here they say, they're talking about the formation of the signifier in the despotic regime, and how that prepares the way for a more deterritorialized signifier in the capitalist regime. So here they're in dialogue with Lacan, and talk about the dialogue, the angry dialogue of certain linguists with Lacan. And they say the signifier as a repressing representation, and the new displaced represented that it induces, the famous metaphors and metonymy, all that constitute the despotic overcoding and deterritorialized machine. So here it works. In the middle, we're getting a little more content to the notion of metaphor, and why from the beginning they will be saying that metaphor is not the best way to characterize what they're doing. So the idea is that metaphor goes with the signifier, term that is connoted, amongst other things, Lacanian. And they're saying it's already deterritorialized. The signifier is deterritorialized with respect to the referential sign. We're getting something that is detached from pure reference and incorporated in the play of representations that repress and representeds that are not the same as the reference, that are displaced, and the play of metaphor and metonymy. So the problem that they find with that is that there are two poles. The signifier is torn between the overcoding despotic machine, so it goes with despots, and so ultimately with paranoia and systems, and its other pole is the use of signifiers in a way that brings them more and more under the axioms of capital, and they become more and more merchandise. And their idea is, if you push that a little bit further, they'll become signs intensities or intensity signs. So that will be the schizophrenic push or acceleration to the capitalist deterritorialization. So going back to the first paragraph, they're saying that these partial objects are machines, and that's not metaphorical. So it's not in this binary demarcation between what's real and hard and concrete, which ultimately is for them just consensus reality, and what is soft arts and letters and metaphor and poetry, and doesn't really come to grips with reality. So it's not a metaphor. It's more deterritorialized even than metaphors are. So once again, that's a sign that what they're doing is, from the beginning, deterritorializing. So you have to understand them in that way. And it's material in the materialist sense. These are real words, but you mustn't take them at their word, and you mustn't take their words for views of the spirit, for or views of the poetic soul or of the beautiful soul either. They're trying to come to grips with the real, not consensus reality, but the real that is involved in the failed dialogue between capitalism and schizophrenia, as said in the title. So there, Deleuze and Guattari are having a real dialogue in order to remedy the failed dialogue between capitalism and schizophrenia. So there are lots of other things that one could say about this progression from actions, breathing, eating, to organs, mouth, breast, and so on, to almost quantum machines, because the anorexic is in a superposed state, or the mouth of the anorexic is in a superposed state between eating, excreting, speaking, and breathing. And the quantum collapse will happen over and over again in different ways. Or it's sort of like the anorexic's mouth is sort of like Schrodinger's cat, only there are not just living or dead, but there are 4 possibilities at least. So it's Schrodinger's mouth. And then moving up a level to Schreber, who can not only describe, but give the theory, and say I. And the I, or it's paranoia in Schreber's case. So it's a deterritorialized I, but not in the same sense that Deleuze and Guattari's I is deterritorialized. He's stuck. Schreber is stuck in his delirium in a literalized way as well. So we could already ask, well, that's interesting, but that doesn't provide us with good advice or good models of action for ourselves in the world as living and thinking beings. So I say the word model because we do need exemplars. And one of the problems with Deleuze and Guattari's work, which they recognize later in A Thousand Plateaus, is they give quite a lot of pathological or pathologized or ultimately sad exemplars. So we're looking for happier, less exploded modes of existence. Anyhow, they go on. The promenade of the schizophrenic, or in the translation, the schizophrenic stroll. The promenade of the schizophrenic to colon. It's a better model than the neurotic lying on the couch. Well, sounds good. They'll go on. It sounds really great. They'll go on to explain it that the schizophrenic is out in nature, in contact with the cosmos. Everything is beautiful, and you can slide as a part into all sorts of cosmic and terrestrial machines and experience nature as a process. It sounds really good, except that it's a schizophrenic, and it's probably up for many problems. We could say the same thing. A better model is in Buddhism. In Zen Buddhism, you have Zen monks and Zen masters on what in Christian terms we could call a pilgrimage. But they're on a Zen promenade. Or Milarepa in Tibetan Buddhism, the poet monk, mystic, who wandered around in the mountains and was in touch with the cosmos and recorded it in songs and poems. So the breast with the mouth, or the mouth with the breast, is one model. Pretty primitive oral form of life, or mode of existence. Then you've got the anorexic, with the mouth that has these multi-functions that are invested as such, although there are interferences. So it's still a pretty oral mode of existence, but revealing the machines and the machinery behind our everyday actions in the world of eating and speaking and breathing and sometimes vomiting and talking. So the anorexic as such, as a model entity, is still not a good model. Maybe anorexia for Deleuze, who was a lecturer, maybe by revealing the oral machinery, led to some good ideas about how to go about lecturing or how to talk with people day to day. But we're still in, if it's not pathological, if you want to argue that anorexia is a mode of existence that has its own value, it's at least pathologized. We're dealing with anorexia. We haven't found a more accurate yet poetic pluralist term. And then we get on to, as a possible model, President Schreiber. Well, that's already better because he was able to argue for successfully for not being committed and to take on his own delirium and speak in his own name about it. So if we're wanting to be thinkers or philosophers, that's a slightly better model, but we're not getting there. It's not. Some aspects of it are more favourable than the other models that have been produced there or preferred, but it's still not a model because we're getting into paranoia, what Lacan would call paranoiac knowledge. All systematic knowledge is paranoiac and based on misrecognition. I think Deleuze and Guattari would not precisely call it misrecognition. They would say there is a real recognition of deterritorializing processes, but the deterritorialization is stopped. It's stopped at a more favorable, more viable, more as they say in Rosa, more agreeable level than the clinical schizophrenic committed to an asylum or equivalent. But it's still, we're still not getting a good model. So they consider, we can almost say it's sort of like a reverie. They think about the organs, the actions. They think about the anorexic. Yes, that's interesting. They think about Schreber. Yes, we read about that when we were younger. That's interesting. And then they think, well, what about the schizophrenic stroll? That's an even, as they say, it's an even better model. It's a better model than the neurotic. Lying on the divan or the couch. So they were right to warn us not to take these things as metaphors, but I think they should have added that we shouldn't take them literally either. An anecdote from personal experience is that when I was in Paris, in 1986, I'd been reading, I'd been going to Deleuze's lectures and reading Deleuze influenced thinkers. And there was a Scottish poet living in Paris, Kenneth White, who talks about the outside all the time, outside in poetry, in Anglo-American literature. And it was very influenced by Deleuze, but there were agonistic dialogical aspects to their relation. Anyhow, he was really good. I discovered that he was actually lecturing at the Sorbonne and that anyone could attend. Well, not exactly anyone. There were too many people. There were maybe 100. And when I came in, he grilled me on who I was. And when I said that I was writing on a thesis on epistemological and ontological pluralism, and especially in the light of Paul Feyerabend, he said, "Good, you can stay. That's your passport for entering and for attending this class." So he was a gatekeeper for his own seminar. And before that friendly conversation, I arrived and people were just there waiting for him, sitting down waiting. And he arrived, and it was summer in Paris, pretty hot summer. And the first thing he said was, what will we do? Will we try and get some a little fresh air, or because there's too much noise, will too bad for the heat, will close the windows. So finally, everyone voted to close the windows, and that was the first shock, intellectual shock, if you want, because this Kenneth White is the poet of the outside, and his first act at the beginning of the course was to close the windows. At a symbolic or metaphorical level, that seemed to be a performative contradiction. But obviously, I would say his outside was not literal and not metaphorical. It was noetic and deterritorialized. Then at some time during one of those classes, and of course he was reading extracts from his thesis on the intellectual nomad or the nomad intellectual, and commenting on them. And somebody from the back of the classroom made an intervention, as the French like to do, and criticized the notion of the neurotic on the couch as a model, and said that she and her friends did a lot of bushwalking, and that brought them in contact with the outside, and was a far better practice than psychoanalysis with its neurotics on couches. And here I thought that she was taking the outside literally. So we're talking about the cone of sense, significations, the signifier deterritorialized into sense, where it has all the possible resonances, the intensive resonances. And so it does mean, otherwise you wouldn't bother using the word of the outside if you really meant just staying inside, shutting the windows, and thinking in an outsider fashion, thinking differently to everyone else. If you just meant that, you wouldn't even use the word. But you can't refuse that level or that aspect of the sense of the outside either, because we have a book in praise of the outside, Anti-OEDIPUS, which was written by a philosopher and an analyst, psychoanalyst or schizoanalyst, whatever, eco-analyst. And most of that was written together or separately in closed rooms. So unless you want to say that they were in performative contradiction, you have to be aware that the outside is not just the literal outside. And if you go out and do bushwalks and you don't change your way of thinking, you're not getting outside of Oedipus, you're not getting outside of the doxa, you're just confirming it. And that's I don't know. That's an important point to retain. The outside is an outside that is noetic, that concerns meaning, and that is deterritorialized outside. And we could be tricked by this progression: actions, machines, organs, and anorexics, and then Schreiber. But, and I'll finish here, but we have not a schizophrenic out for a walk, but we have Buchner, a dramaturge, poet, novelist, writing a poetic vision of a schizophrenic out for a walk. So we're back on the spatial inside, but the noetic outside once again.